Hey everyone, it's Noor. For this month's episode of Ad Tech Unfiltered, we're zoning in on an important topic: data privacy and the future of ad targeting. It's an issue we really can't talk about enough in this anticipated final year where advertisers say farewell to their long-standing reliance on third-party cookie data. To discuss this topic, we speak to Pedro Pavon. He oversees a team of policy directors at Facebook. He and his team address privacy, data protection, fairness, and a slew of other topics connected to the matter. Lately, it's become too common for people in the ad industry to talk about data privacy only to review the latest privacy updates dictated by legislation and big tech players. But how did we get here? And what do new laws and tech updates accomplish for consumers, for brands, marketers, and ad tech players? Pedro shares his thoughts on legislative policy and regulative implications, what advertisers and marketers should be reflecting on, and more. This episode on data privacy and ad targeting with Pedro Pavon starts right now. All right, so we're talking to Pedro Pavon today about data privacy, the impact on identifiers, and the future of targetability in advertising. I appreciate you making time to record this episode of Ad Tech Unfiltered.
Well, thanks for having me. It's my pleasure, and I enjoy any time I can spend with friends.
I'm going to dial the conversation way back because the thing that maybe bothers me the most about any conversations about data and privacy is that it's happening at the most advanced level. And I feel that a lot of people aren't able to follow along unless they're keeping up to date on everything that Google and Apple and all the other big tech players are doing. So let's take 10 steps back. What are just some of the obvious or transparent ways that data is being collected that led us down to this path today where people are even reflecting on consumer privacy? So I'll just throw out a really simple example to start. I think about how I've openly and choicefully shared some of my first party data with Starbucks, but curious about other transparent ways that data is being shared in the digital age.
There's a lot of ways. I mean, the obvious one here is like social media, right? People share tremendous sections of their life online and make it available to their friends and to companies and to the social media platforms themselves to see, view, and use. And people who go and interact with brands online have some expectation that those brands are going to make a note of that and find ways to interact with them more. So that's like a marketing context, but the same is for like organizations. Like if I spend a lot of time on, the Facebook page of a, nonprofit cause that I'm interested in, I don't think I'd be super surprised if I ended up getting a message from them or a follow-up. So I think those are the ways that people have kind of become accustomed to understanding that their data is being used. I think others are a little bit less like fancy online. Loyalty programs. I think most consumers understand that when they sign up for like a CVS or a Kroger or a Whole Foods loyalty program, that's going to result in those companies sending them coupons and sending them information about sales. Those are some of like the overt, like somewhat easy to understand ways that data collection has become a pretty normal part of our life.
I figure what's really at the center of so much of today's consumer privacy conversations focuses on cookie and the collection of cookie data. So I actually wanted to just read a little bit from this Pew Research study on Americans and digital knowledge that was taken 2 years ago, and in which they asked a series of different questions about digital topics. But one in particular was about cookies. And the question that they posed was, cookies allow websites to track users' visits and site activity. And 63% of people answered the question correctly. I assume it was a yes/no question. 27% said that they weren't sure, and 9% answered that question incorrectly. I think it was a pretty simplistic look at cookies, right, to say that there's quote unquote tracking of user visitation and site activity. Knowing that this only took place 2 years ago, do you think that that sounds about right as far as people having some semblance of understanding of what cookies are doing? Or is this just like too soft and diluted of showcasing people's understanding of cookies? Because there's so much more to it than just that tracking across that single site.
Yeah, I think it's hard for the average person to follow along with how cookies work and how sort of persistent they are across websites that in the lives of those users don't have a relationship with each other, right? Like I don't think it's fair to have to believe consumers have a reasonable expectation that what they're doing on their bank site directly is informed by well, bank site's a bad example, but what they're doing on Amazon is informed by what they did on Facebook. Like that is confusing to people and not intuitive and complex, and it's hard to explain. I'm not surprised that average people don't understand the like technical ways in which their information is shared across platforms and websites. I've been at this for like 14 years now or whatever it is. Like it's hard for me to understand. And I'd spend all day thinking about like what the rules are for these like third party data sharing arrangements and what the best practices are. So now put yourself in the seat of a bus driver, or of a doctor or of a teacher who has an entire life that they need to worry about and 1,000 things on their mind. The last thing they're going to spend time trying to understand is how like third party cookies track them across websites as they, interact with the brands and the companies and the organizations that they love. Like to me, it's not a fair ask of people. And so like this idea that the increasing transparency and detail is somehow putting power in people's hands, I think is a little bit misguided because it's information overload and people shouldn't be expected to become data privacy experts just because they use the internet.
You were getting into an example about banking, but you kind of backed out of it. But I think about a relationship that a consumer has with their bank, and occasionally you'll get direct mail from your bank about information that they're collecting, and then the ability or opportunity to opt out of them sharing it with some other parties. Some of it you have choice around, some of it you may not. But as far as just getting something that's really clearly communicated to you, I think that's like one of the issues with us living in a digital world, is that some of the ways in which those prompts are being brought to our attention around information being collected on us are not transparent enough. Do you agree as far as the way that cookie prompts come up on websites when we visit them? Should more be done to clarify what is being collected and how it's being collected, or do you think we've progressed far from where we were in the past?
Well, let's talk about like cookie prompts and banners and whatever. Having traveled to Europe, browsing the internet in Europe is difficult because every website has tons of disclosures that have to pop up before you get to the content that you want to see. Most of us access the internet on our phones. Increasingly, we're accessing the internet without screens through like, Amazon Echo devices and Google Home devices and iPhone's Siri technology. Like I'm not interacting with a screen. And so how these disclosures are going to play out in real time there in that ecosystem, it remains to sort of be seen. Speaking specifically about cookies, the current requirements and regulatory ecosystem makes the average consumer's internet experience, in my opinion, less desirable. Forget that I'm a data privacy lawyer or expert policy person. Forget all of that. Like just going on the internet to entertain myself or to find information or watch videos or to do my homework, that experience is harmed in a way when I have like admin that I have to do every single time I do that, right? And like every time I go to a new website, I've got all this administrative stuff that I have to do. I don't know that that is the way to really not only take into consideration like the meaningful user experience that companies and organizations want to give their visitors on their sites, but also just like how annoying it is for me as a person to like have to go. I'm like, okay, here's another cookie banner. All right. For example, if I buy a new device where all the cookie banners are going to display again for the first time, is it reasonable to expect that I'm going to read all of the information there every single time? I don't think, I think the answer is no. To me, like the way things work now is not sustainable, especially as people spend more and more and more time online. And then having this expectation that people are reading all of this and making informed decisions, I also think is a little bit unrealistic.
I definitely don't think that, to your earlier point, people are spending the time going and reading all of those prompts. But I do think that the systems that have put these prompts into place are relying on people to not read them in depth, and then also don't give people a lot of options to opt out of what's there. Like the functionality of the website is reliant on or contingent upon you accepting those cookies. And I've definitely had experiences in online environments where if I want to access a white paper or something else, like that's, been like the lead generation tactic to get me to share some sort of first party information. It's not going to operate until I accept those cookies or accept the sharing of some other type of information. So I'm just being trained to know that I have to accept no matter what. And my like literacy around understanding like what is being compromised isn't a part of the equation. So I feel like it's the experience piece is a part of it, but also making sure that people have an opportunity to control what is and isn't being disclosed isn't being that well considered.
Yeah, and think about this. Nobody sees it as controversial if, like, the New York Times says, if you want to read my content or you want to access our content, you've got to pay us $5 a month and put it behind a paywall. Nobody bats an eye at that. But then everyone says, well, if instead of me charging you the $5, I'll go make those $5 somewhere else. But what you're going to give me is some insight into your interests that I'm going to determine using math. And then I'm going to market your attention to other parties, which is advertising. I'm going to help my partners advertise to you, and then I'll give you this content for free. And then that becomes extremely controversial because of the data privacy implications involved.
What do you think has contributed the most to us now being in a climate that's so intently focused on consumer protection?
Well, I think there's like a couple things. One, a few companies have been really successful and made a lot of money taking advantage of all of the data collection practices that were unregulated. They didn't do anything illegal per se. I mean, I'm sure some did and got in trouble, but in the absence of specific rules, people created tremendously complicated and effective, essentially like data tracking tech, right? That's a lot of what ad tech is. I mean, I'd say like 50% of ad tech is delivering the ad. The other 50% is figuring out who to deliver the ad to, right? Who best to deliver the ad to and optimizing that. All of this kind of like marketing tracking based technology caught the attention of regulators, rightfully so. This is not a new phenomenon. It's new for ad tech, but it's happened before, right? Like, when oil was discovered, there was a long tail before like reasonable environmental regulations were implemented to make sure that oil companies had to operate within some sort of reasonable framework to protect the environment and to protect people. Cars, same thing. Like the first cars weren't safe. Like they were literally like danger, death traps, right? And then over time, through scrutiny and regulation and enforcement of those regulations, cars have gotten much safer. There's still work to be done. I think ad tech is going through that transformation. Marketing online is going through that transformation. What I hope for is, like we did not do with cars or with petrol products, we don't just take these like crazy positions of like, well, personalized advertising is bad, we should just ban it. Like in a world that has guns and nuclear weapons, like a personalized ads ban just seems to me like a little bit ridiculous, right? I think the better answer there is to understand the inherent value that has been created through the free internet because of the revenues generated by personalization, and to then make sure that there are appropriate safeguards. And so I'm not an opponent of regulation, and I'm not an opponent of reasonable scrutiny and certainly enforcement when people operate outside of the bounds of what's permitted. What I want to make sure is that we regulate ourselves in a way that is conducive to creativity and innovation, advances the free internet, and also provides people safety. Striking that balance, I think, is an experimentation process. One way to go too far is to be heavy-handed and just rule things out as inherently evil or inherently problematic.
Pedro, you brought up moments ago a point about the value of personalization and reasons why it doesn't make sense to abandon impactful and legitimate ways to target. Where would you say is the middle ground as far as legislators holding data collectors more responsible for consumer privacy, but still giving enough permissions to enable impactful ways to target?
Well, I think it's like two things. One, like your data collection practices need to be tied to what consumer knows about them. And what I mean by that is like the purpose for which you're collecting needs to be transmitted in a way that that user understands it. And you can't use it outside those bounds, right? So like if you say, hey, I'm going to collect XYZ information from you and use it for my own internal marketing purposes, well, then you can't turn around and share that data with third parties and let them use it for their marketing purposes, right? So being transparent and telling the truth matters, and having consumers understand what's being collected and for what purpose also matters. I don't like the way we're being forced to do it, because I think it is there has to be better ways to transmit that information in a way that is a meaningful and useful user experience that doesn't diminish or annoy consumers. And so I think that's one thing. You talk about bad actors. Look, you can pass all the laws you want to. There's been a law in the books in the United States that theft is illegal for hundreds of years. People still steal. And so you want to be able to punish those people. And I understand, but the idea of like creating laws to stop bad actors, look, bad actors are going to do bad things. This is really about making sure companies have a framework that they can operate within, that advances safety and gives them a way to be compliant and successful. Because I don't think most of the tech companies that are very successful, or even the ones that are emerging, especially on the context of social media, like set out to destroy the world. I just don't think that's true. There are a lot of good intentions there, and there were not a lot of rules on the books, and that experimental period led to some problem. And so now we're like correcting for that. I just worried that we overcorrect. An overcorrection now would mean that like incumbents remain powerful and like new entrants into the market have difficulty, and nobody wants that.
Going back to that point about bad actors versus the utilization of technology and data that can be used in very purposeful ways, I think the way that I'm thinking about it, and I imagine this is at least in part, if not largely a part of what these regulations are thinking of, is that the responsibility to tighten up the guardrails around the sharing of that data falls heavily on the brands and advertisers that are trusted to not pass that data along too loosely, because that's something that does happen very regularly, right? Like you're in the business of collecting data in a friendly way, whether you're in the data aggregation space or you're a brand or a business that's going to sell your data in some capacity, and you do have some technical permissions to do it, but then not understanding what that looks like as far as whose hands that data is going towards. So do you feel the new regulations that are coming into effect or that are already in effect are going to do a better job of tightening up and protecting the data that's being collected from legitimate companies?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with companies sharing data with each other that they've collected from their users. That doesn't strike me as inherently unethical and philosophically problematic, and, as a matter of nature or otherwise, like should be illegal. I think it's just a question of what information gets shared, and for what purpose. I don't think that over prescribing that is a smart way to go, because again, it kind of limits the ability to experiment. What I think is most important, though, is that companies be clear and be held to the promises they make. So if company A says, I'm only going to share data with these types of parties and for these types of purposes, and the company doesn't do that, then there should be an enforcement mechanism for regulators to use to punish them, or otherwise have them take corrective measures to fix that if it was unintentional, or whatever it is. But suggesting that one industry by its nature can't share with another industry just because, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like there's a lot of arbitrary narrative out there about just like data sharing is bad, and I've yet to find a compelling argument how that's so. And that's driving a lot of hysteria, a lot of media attention, and a lot of regulatory action. It just seems a little misguided to me.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think we've taken a large leap, maybe a leap too large, as far as how far we've gone from whatever space we were in, let's say like 10 plus years ago, when there was personally identifiable information that was like very much tied to the way that we were able to target consumers, and going from there into a space where people are in lockboxes and you can't target with any sense of meaningful personalization. I hear that point. So just knowing where everything stands today, I do want to get your perspective on how much more advertisers should be planning to rely on first-party data with consideration for where the law is netting out.
Yeah, I mean, if you're watching what's happening, I think access to and signal from third-party data is decreasing, and it's not just regulators. The platforms, iOS, Google are making it so in the absence of laws. When we look at the direction of travel with respect to third-party data, I think advertisers, ad tech, everyone in the advertising ecosystem online needs to be really focused on, first of all, protecting access to first-party data for marketing purposes and making sure we can continue to use it in the long term. And then second of all, finding new ways to get the most value out of first-party data, because signal loss from third-party is real. It's coming. Anybody watching this knows that. And it's not just laws. It's the way the platforms are policing apps and behaviors in their ecosystems suggest to anyone paying attention that the glory days of third-party data may be behind us.
So, knowing that the glory days of third party data may be behind us, are there any words of comfort that you would share with some of those advertisers who might be maybe, I don't want to say needlessly distraught, but maybe more distraught than they need to be as far as some of that data having room to grow in terms of the quality of that data and room and reason to shift over into first party data?
Yeah, the first reason is you're gonna have less of it, right? Like the first reason to move away from third party is every signal, every indicator I see suggests that the direction of travel is less access. The other thing is, I don't think we've tapped into all the value around first party. I just don't think so. If I had R&D money and I was in an ad tech company that heavily relies on third party, but has some first party component to the business, I'd be investing in first party. Now, if you're strictly in the third party space and don't have a third party data component to your business, it's a tough time. And, I don't know all the answers. I can't say for sure that like my instincts on the direction of travel, the deprecation of third party data is a sure thing. I would not be sleeping super well if my entire business relied on access to third party data. I would be working really hard to find new ways to do whatever it is I do.
I think what comes to mind for me is that there are many advertisers who sometimes are looking for comfort with the idea that there's going to be this replacement solution that also comes that's born out of the ad tech space that's going to replicate the types of ROI that they were already getting from cookies, and that there should be something that's derived that gives them identical results. Like that's really what it boils down to. Like, how do I replicate the ROI that I'm getting from existing advertising campaigns?
No, sorry, I was going to say, well, we'll have to look at some things like, in light of Apple's changes with IDFA, do they create an advertising solution? There are a million reasons why that's a really complicated answer, but sitting from the position of an advertiser, like if Apple is making it hard for me as a new app or a new developer, small business to leverage third party data because of the IDFA changes, well, is Apple going to provide a solution on the platform? I don't know, but I would hope so if I was an advertiser. But for Google and the deprecation of cookies, Google is working on a solution that they say is going to work. Now, there's a lot of questions about Flock and how all of that's going to play out. But yes, I don't think it's unreasonable for advertisers to hope that the industry comes up with solve. I mean, I know Trade Desk is working on something. I know some of the Chinese app developers are, I guess, working on workarounds for Apple's IDFA changes. I don't know too much about that, but I've heard that it's happening. And so I think for sure there's a lot of look, like if you boil it down to the basics, there's a lot of money on the table in ad tech, right? And people can figure out how to solve for these changes that the platforms are making. Somebody's going to try because they know that if they get it right, they're going to make a ton of money. From the position of an advertiser and not like a programmatic ad tech company, like two things. You can't sit around and wait for that solution. So invest in, if you've got an advertising spend now that you want to do and you want to reach the most interested users in your stuff, Facebook and Google offer like first party driven solutions for that stuff. And if I was an advertiser, and Snapchat and TikTok and all the other platforms, Twitter, and I would look into those platforms as my first place to spend money. And then the other piece is don't sit around waiting for this third party solution to come. But it is possible. And I'm sure there are a lot of really brilliant people trying to figure out if there's a way to continue to leverage third party in light of all of the changes happening on the app platforms.
If I was an advertiser, to your point, I mean, there's no reason for me to not continue dipping into the big tech players that are out there and the first party data that they can give me access to. But I need to, in tandem, have an aggressive first party acquisition strategy so that I can like build up, and it's not going to be replicated as far as like how much scale I was going to have access to from a third party standpoint from some of these players that were historically giving me access to it. But I have that responsibility to have a backup plan. And I just think a lot of advertisers to date, especially smaller advertisers, don't have a backup plan. They're just relying on these tools that were sold into them as an easy solution, but there was no expiry date as far as when they would no longer be able to dip into them. And some of these businesses are 100% reliant on them in order to gain new business.
You nailed it, by the way. I mean, I'm glad you said that because that's exactly right. If I was, not only would I be tapping into the large platforms and leveraging like their tremendous first party data assets for my advertising purposes, I'd be aggressively building out my own view of my own customers and people interested in my stuff. The problem with that is it's expensive and it's hard. And, how do you do that when you're a small app? Like, look at, mean, Clubhouse is kind of a bad example because they're a social media app, but like they just seem to be like the viral app these days. Like, how many employees does Clubhouse have? I bet you it's under 100, right? Like, how much do they invest in something like this? Like, I don't, not that they're advertising anyway, but if you're a small app with 10 employees, um, how do you invest in this like first party data acquisition strategy when, you're barely keeping the lights on? Like, it's just an unfair proposition. And so then, like, the business question is, well, then how do you scale if you can't reach the people that are interested in your stuff, right? I mean, it's tricky. It's a conundrum. It's a catch-22. It's all of those cliches. And I don't know that, the big platforms making these changes and imposing them on everyone are being extremely thoughtful about this.
Along those lines, I was going to ask you a question about these big tech players and the disproportionate impact that they have on the vast majority of ad spending. I know you've talked about this a little bit, but I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on the tricky position that they're in as far as giving advertisers continued access to scalable and desirable audiences, but then also needing to be, I don't know if you want to call it first movers or how you want to describe it, but having this responsibility to abide by the law and come up with consumer privacy solutions that abide by the law, but then also don't have a terribly negative impact on the rest of the advertising ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, in order to make changes that meet those two criteria, you have to care about both of those. It's not clear to me that there was a lot of thought given to half of your point, which is like, aside from the privacy goals of some of these changes, how does it affect the millions of developers and small businesses that rely on the ecosystem, make their revenue through personalized ads or use personalized ads to drive traffic and interest in their product? It's frustrating because if I were a small business or a small app developer trying to make a name for myself, I'd be really terrified right now, given the changes happening on the two mobile platforms. And I don't know that there's anything that can be done, like, because how do you stop something that's happening, especially when it's being driven by one company that isn't really seeking a tremendous amount of input in one case, and then in the Google's case, like, I think they're being a little bit, they're being more kind of collaborative and listening to the industry. But ultimately, Google's going to design this in ways that they feel works best for their business. In the end, we're all sort of beholden to these decisions and forced to react to them, and also on timelines that aren't super transparent. Like, I'm not sure. I mean, we've all been kind of under siege here since the beginning of the year, waiting for the iOS changes to roll out. Do you have any signal exactly when they're going to roll out? Like, nobody knows. Like, if I'm a small business, right? Like, it's hard to run my business when I literally, if I'm being asked, hey, so when's the prompt coming up? I don't know. Like, right? How does Central respond to your customers when you're asked that question, right? You got to tell them you don't know. And that's a frustrating way to be. Super difficult times. And again, I don't think either of the platforms is out here to be malicious and destroy the internet and these things. I just worry that maybe the impact of this was underappreciated a little bit on, not like the Facebooks and the Snapchats and the TikToks of the world, but on, the mom and pops and the medium-sized companies that, to your point, really rely on the infrastructure that's there to get the word out about themselves or their stuff.
I think there's this bizarre silence that has taken place, and or maybe I'm not observing carefully enough around how incredibly inequitable the systems are, right? Where there's just a couple players at the top, and then we kind of wait until the gods tell us what we are going to know at the moment that they choose to tell us. We're kind of like very accepting of that. And I don't know that there's enough conversation around needing to know, or rather needing to create spaces for those other stakeholders, even if it's hundreds of thousands of stakeholders who are the people who like tap into these platforms, to give them more information about what you're doing. And even if they obviously don't have an equal say in sharing what their desire is, which is to like not make these drastic changes that are going to impact their businesses in devastating ways, but still thinking about them. And I think when you put yourself behind a wall and silently make a lot of these changes, it's really unfair what impact that's going to have on the industry. So to your point, yes, like too often we have to tell clients, like, we don't know, and we'll know closer to when you would have access to knowing, because it's going to be publicly accessible information. So it's very frustrating.
Yeah, and like that would be a bad way to run a family. That would be a bad way to run a sports team. That would be a bad way to run a nonprofit, and that's a bad way to like be a pillar in an ecosystem, right? Like to operate unilaterally and dictate to others without input. It's tough. And again, I don't want to sound like like I'm angry or bitter or miserable. And I work for a tremendously large tech company that has, been accused of engaging in some of the same things. But with that said, like it's still frustrating, right? I mean, and I can totally understand where small businesses are coming from, and not just small businesses, big businesses too, that rely on the same ecosystem. It's a strange time to be in ad tech because two things are happening. There's tremendous increased regulatory attention and legal headwinds, right? We know that data privacy is now becoming a like globally regulated issue. And simultaneously, some companies are deciding to market themselves by having like some really lockdown, what is presented as like lockdown privacy practices. And in doing so, are creating tremendous negative business impact on thousands of companies and hundreds of thousands of other ones. And like, that's not a phenomenon that's that common. I mean, I'm not an economist, but like, think about the power of, Apple and Google in the context of the thousands and thousands, maybe even millions of apps on both of their platforms. They can make one sweeping decision and affect every single app overnight. And I don't think the companies make overnight decisions, but I do think that that's also something worth some regulatory scrutiny, which is what is the power of these platforms? Has there ever been corporations that have this much power to affect like competition and revenue and just customer engagement by their competitors or other just companies that have nothing to do with them? And second of all, like is that something that needs some scrutiny and attention? I think the answer is yes.
Completely agreed and aligned there. So just knowing that we will, at least for the time being, be in this purgatorial state of not knowing exactly what comes next. And people are sleeping with one eye open, at least in the short term, as far as all the things that you just described, seeing what shakes out from consumer privacy, but also the future of addressability standpoint. Are there just like in your analysis of new information and updates to come, are there things that you're staying up to date on that you're particularly curious to see net out, or just like new updates that you're excited about for the future of consumer privacy and identity?
Yeah, there's like three things. One we've just spent a long time talking about, which is what the big platforms do. Like I'm watching Apple and Google very closely as they make decisions about privacy that affect my company, but also just affect the ecosystem at large. And A, trying to figure out how to navigate those, and B, making judgment calls or just like deciding for myself whether I think they're appropriate or not, right? So that's one thing I'm watching super closely. Another is like the proliferation of privacy rules in Europe, right? So GDPR a couple of years ago laid the foundation for all of these new things. You've got the DSA, you've got the DMA, you've got the EDPB guidelines, you've got e-privacy. There's just a tremendous amount of regulatory change in Europe that everyone should be watching closely if they are in our business, because it's just going to affect. Europe has this like incredible ability to like drive transformative change all over the world, sometimes good, sometimes bad. Historically, I would argue fairly bad. Like just think like imperialism being like a export of Europe and not being a good thing. But also like sometimes good, right? I think GDPR like lit a fire in the rest of the world to like think about and take privacy more seriously. And that leads to my third point, which is like we're seeing the proliferation of privacy rules all over China, India, Singapore, Australia, Brazil, California, now Virginia. There are bills all in states all over the United States. Canada has made some updates to their privacy laws. The UK during Brexit has, working on not new laws, but like adequacy agreements between them and the EU. So like watching privacy laws proliferate around the world is just, as a privacy nerd, just something really interesting. It's also scary because if you work inside one of the companies that has to comply with all of these rules at the same time, how we're going to do that is a question I grapple with all the time. But then I work at Facebook, a huge, gigantic corporation with lots of resources. Now I think about it in the context of Clubhouse. Super cool app, emerging quickly, like, 10 million users already. When they open it up to Android, I'm sure it will explode. How does Clubhouse like build the necessary infrastructure to comply with all of the laws on the books now and all of the ones emerging around us every day? Like, where do they get the money to make the investments necessary to do that? How do they scale and build their business at the same time? These are real difficult questions. And, the answer can't be, well, then, maybe Clubhouse shouldn't exist, because clearly the world has decided that Clubhouse should exist and people want to use it. And so, what's the next Clubhouse? And will it be able to grow and scale and enrich people's lives given the incredible like privacy regulatory constraints that are being designed all over the world? I don't know the answer, but I am sort of uh, concerned about that. So those are the three.
So, Pedro, you just positioned a lot of complicated and convoluted curiosities for the future. And what I'm curious to know about is just knowing that you're specifically responsible for doing privacy work at Facebook. How do you stay on top of all this? How do you make sure you're accessing and educating yourself with the most up to date information on consumer privacy in a way that can be applicable for you to have conversations with people who need to advance the future of Facebook and just for your overall education on what's happening in this industry?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So, like, I'm a spoiled brat in that regard. I work at Facebook. So, anytime I want to talk to anybody about privacy, they want to talk to me about it. I have access to the top thinkers, the best law firms, and the best and smartest colleagues, right? I could ever wish for. Every conversation I have at Facebook has privacy weaved into it. The company has thousands of people thinking about privacy at all times. And that's how it should be because Facebook has a lot of work to do in this space, and the decisions Facebook makes around privacy affect billions of people. So it's the right thing for Facebook to do, and it should continue to do it and do so at a high level. With all that being said, I can't personally. If you're asking me if I pay me myself, if I can keep up, no, of course I can't. I literally don't have the brain capacity to keep up with just the events of one day, nevertheless, 1 week or a month or a year. It's just too many moving parts all at once. And I think the spirit of your question is really like, can anybody keep track of all of this? And no, the answer is definitely no. Now, I just told you about all the great resources I have and all the smart people I'm surrounded by, and my ability to just pick up a phone and call the best law firm and ask them the hardest question and get an answer right away. Let's go back to Clubhouse, okay? And I'm not picking on them. I love Clubhouse. If I was the chief privacy officer at Clubhouse, I don't have a several hundred person policy team and hundreds of lawyers at my disposal and millions of dollars in budgeting resources to figure out whatever question I'm concerned with today. Like, how can we expect an emerging app like Clubhouse to operate like Google, Facebook, or Twitter when they haven't had the benefit yet of scaling to a size big enough that they can spend all of the money and hire all of the talent necessary to keep up with what is a rapidly changing asymmetric privacy regulatory landscape? I don't think it's reasonable to expect because it's impossible to do that. I would be terrified of building an app that involves people engaging on my platform, given like just the headwinds that I'm aware of.
I guess where I'm curious is to what extent are new and popular apps like Clubhouse going to be held responsible for the lack of consumer privacy that's actually offered within the confines of their app, and to what extent can they be held responsible versus not responsible? And also, just in relation to your larger point, what I'm taking away is that there needs to be more thoughtfully considered legislation, maybe some more definitively like measured legislation, so that there can be more thoughtful and considerate ad solutions that are put into the space that we all work in from an advertising standpoint.
I think that's right. I don't want to make it seem like I don't think any regulator or any policymaker is thinking about this, right? And you see evidence of the idea of not stifling innovation and things like, like if you have X amount of users, then this, if you have Y, then that, and the obligations increasing depending on how many users you have or how many people's data you're collecting or whatever it is. And in theory, that feels good. Let's just stick with Clubhouse. Clubhouse already has 10 million users. It hasn't made a penny. In fact, it's operating at a daily loss, right? And it does, it doesn't have a revenue model yet. I'd be surprised if it doesn't have 50 or 60 million users in the next few months. Then what? It still hasn't made a dollar. Now it has to comply with these new, all these rules that get triggered just by its scale, but it doesn't have the revenue backing yet to build the resources and the teams necessary to do all that stuff. Sometimes I'm humbled by the limits of my intelligence, and I don't have the solutions for these, right? Like I don't think I'm smart enough, but I am smart enough to see the problem. My hope is that people smarter than I will think about how to create avenues so that innovation can continue and people all around the world can continue to be enriched by like just cool technology.
Every person is feeling like they're drowning in the complexities of what's taking place in the industry. Pedro, I know you just came back from vacation. You made time for this, and I very much appreciate it.
Thanks, my friend. This is a good chat, and I wish it. I know I feel like it was kind of somber and daunting, but like it's the truth. Let's do a part two about all the upside because there is some.
Thanks again to Pedro Pavon, who oversees privacy, fairness, and data policy at Facebook. Pedro alluded to this. It is really tricky to stay on top of the latest and greatest about data privacy and all the implications for advertisers, marketers, and ad tech players. An important takeaway for me is that alongside reading up about what's happening, we all need to be asking more about why things are happening the way that they are. You might also want to follow Pedro on Clubhouse, where he can be found extensively speaking on the topic of data privacy. That's it for this month's episode. I'm Noor Nasir for AdTech Unfiltered. We'll catch you next time for our next episode.